I said yes to things in my 20s that make me want to scream in my 30s. The yeses were coming from this place of empowerment and feeling like I was stepping into my power. But now, as a 31-year-old and looking back on that time, I can see that I was just taking a step towards massive self-abandonment. And, I didn't necessarily know that at the time. There were some pretty big emotional things that were happening in my life that just sort of engulfed me and took me away. And I couldn't regulate my nervous system for long enough to understand or feel like my feet were on the ground in order for myself to make these grounded, level-headed decisions. That just wasn't something that I could really tap into at the time. So today, I just want to paint the picture for you on the one thing that has changed my quality of life so much in my 30s that I wish I would have known about it sooner. So let's get into it. We're going to rewind it back to when I was 24. I was in this massive time of expansion. I had been living in Chicago for, I think, a little over a year, and I had just moved into my first solo apartment. Before that, I had lived on friends' couches. I had a roommate, but this was like the first time where I was like, yes, I'm getting my own apartment. And it was in Lakeview. It was in this high-rise building on the 19th floor. It had lake views. It had south-facing city views. It had a pool on the roof. I really felt like I had made it. And, this was coming from a time of just having built a life for myself in Chicago. When I first made the decision to move to Chicago, my parents were basically like, if you want to do it, you have to do it on your own, financially. You have to figure it out. And so I did. And so there I was moving into my first solo apartment in Chicago, and I felt like I had made it. I had built this life for myself. I could afford this incredible apartment with insane views of the city of Chicago in a wonderful area. It was my dream apartment at the time. Now, a few days after I moved in, I flew to San Francisco. I was going with a group of friends. We were going for our friend's wedding, and it was our first friend in the friend group who was getting married. And so we were all going, months had gone into the planning of this trip, and me and one of my other friends had literally planned the trip to a T, like down to the minute of where we were going to be, what we were going to do, etc. So we go on this trip and, we land and everyone's super excited. I remember, we all threw our bags into the car and we just wanted to get the show on the road. We wanted to start our vacation immediately. And so what that looked like was we went to Trader Joe's, got a picnic for ourselves. We drive to Baker Beach. We park in the parking lot. There's a bunch of other people around. And, it was a pretty crowded place. And we're like, okay, cool. Like, we have our picnic. Let's get out. Let's get our stuff and let's go set up. It was pretty windy and cold. And, we sort of got tired of the whole sit on a beach and eat vibe. Sand was getting everywhere. So we go back up, we find a picnic bench, we sit down, fast forward, and my friend runs back to the car. She's like, I'm going to go grab something. And I think she wanted a jacket or something. So she goes back to the car. And a couple minutes after she left the table, she comes back screaming. And she's like, guys, somebody broke into the car. And I could just tell by the tone in her voice that she wasn't kidding. And so we all went running. Some people thought she was kidding, but I was just like, no, this is real. So we run to the car. We see that every window is basically smashed. All of our luggage was taken. Literally all of our personal belongings that were in that car, gone. And I mean everything, like my wallet was gone. The only thing I had was my phone, thank God. But like my wallet was gone, other people's wallets were gone, our work electronics were gone, our personal electronics were gone, our contact lenses were gone, our glasses were gone, every single bit of clothing item we brought was gone. For me, it sort of like sent me into this freeze of just like, oh my God, what do we do? And then everyone else starts to have their own reactions. And like, thank God, one of us was like, I'm calling 911. And, I think a lot of us were in just such a state of shock that had even happened. And we didn't know what to do. And, the only thing that I could really think of in that time was like, God damn it. My cousin, who had lived in the area for years, she had texted me like 3 hours prior and literally warned me about this very thing. She was like, look, smash and grabs are a huge issue in San Francisco. You have to be careful. And I had gotten that text thinking like, oh, we'll be fine. There I find myself 3 hours later. All of my belongings are taken. All of my friends' belongings were taken. We called the police and we had to create a very detailed police report, but the police were like, look, we can't. This happens all the time. And the problem is so big that we can't even track down people's stuff. The likelihood of you getting your stuff back is very small. And so we do that. We go on our way. We're driving this car that has all the windows like busted out of it. The back windshield, the back rear windows, like everything. And so we're getting a nice breeze in the car. I mean, the breeze is just insane. And, in that time, we sort of just pivoted to like, oh my God, we're not going to be able to see out of our eyes after today. Oh my God, my contacts are gone. Oh my God, my glasses are gone. I literally will not be able to see tomorrow. And, we're like viciously calling our eye doctors. We're like, that was literally the number one thing. We're like, we could go to Target. We could get more clothes. We could, we can get whatever we need, but the contacts, huge issue. So ironically, the only time my eye doctor has ever called me was on the drive from the airport to Trader Joe's before we went to Baker Beach that day. And he called me and he's like, hey, Allie, just checking in. How's everything going? Like, I forget what we were talking about. I was like, oh, I'm good. We just got to San Francisco. So there I was after we had just talked to the police officer. And I'm like relentlessly trying to get a hold of my eye doctor again. And I'm like talking to the front desk person, like, I don't think you understand. Like, I won't be able to see after tomorrow. Put the doctor on the phone. And so I finally talked to him, got him on the phone, and he's like, Allie, what the hell happened? Like, I just talked to you a few hours ago and everything was fine. And so I'm explaining the whole situation to them. And, we're all like a bunch of my friends are just on the phone with our eye doctors at the same time in this car. And luckily, we were able to convince our eye doctors to send our prescription to a local eye doctor called Palo Alto Eyes. I will never forget. And so we all go to this eye doctor and we walk in and it's just like the handwritten note that was stuck to the contact boxes. Like, it was just hilarious of just like girl who got the car broken into and lost her contacts. Like, that was the identifier on the sticky note. And so, we get our contacts and we then go to Target and I'm like, we're getting every single possible thing that we lost. And, as this was going on, we were all still in shock. And we weren't sure if we were going to get our stuff back. And, so we continue on. We canceled all of our hotel reservations. We're like, okay, we're just staying at our friend's house, who she grew up in the area. And so we all just aligned on piling in at her house and like bless her family for hosting us. So we get to Target, we go through the line, we, pay for our stuff. Then we go to In-N-Out. And because we need dinner, of course, and like we have no capacity to go anywhere nice. And so we get to In-N-Out. The drive-thru is so long, we're like, oh my God, we have to go inside. But all the windows of the car are busted out, and we have all these bags from Target, and we're like, guess we got to bring the bags into In-N-Out. So we're all, picture like 5 girls just walking into In-N-Out with a hell of a lot of Target bags. And we're just like so disheveled. We just want food. We order so much food from In-N-Out. And then we go back to our friend's house to eat the food. We're all sitting around the dinner table, eating our In-N-Out in complete silence because we were just so in shock. We were just like, how the hell did this happen to us? What's going on? And then I get a call. And at this point, I'm answering any phone call that I receive. I didn't recognize the phone number, but I was just like, I don't care who it is. I'm answering it. So I answer the phone, and it's Purdue Police. Now, I went to Purdue University, and this is Purdue Police calling. And they're like, where are you? Are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I am okay, but I got robbed earlier. How do you know about this? Like, why are you calling? I'm confused. And they were like, well, there's a Good Samaritan who found a whole bunch of women's clothing scattered about in a park. And they found your Purdue ID in one of the wallets that was scattered around the park. They had given me the phone number of this woman who was the Good Samaritan. And I remember calling her, and just the feeling of relief in her voice and just hearing her perspective on like her experience and what she saw in picking up all these items, it was just, it made such an impact in my mind. And it almost like, it really put into perspective for me of like how scary the situation really was. And, yes, it was super scary from the perspective of living it, but for when you zoom out and look at the whole picture of like somebody finding our items scattered around in a park, and all they know is they're seeing a bunch of women's clothing and like wallets and IDs and like shit like that, that's so scary. And so anyways, like we're all just so grateful that somebody found something of ours, and we arranged to meet at the police station that night, and the police station was like an hour away, and we're like, we don't care, we're going. And so we got a ride to the police station. In all of this, it was just a very intense realization that I had stuff to lose. And really for the first time in my life, and by stuff to lose, I mean from a financial perspective. I had worked so hard to build the life for myself that I had at that point. And in that, being such a good steward of the money that I had, and like in building up financial stability for myself, especially in a city where it's notoriously expensive. And so I was really proud of myself for building that financial stability at that time. And so coming to this realization of like, oh my God, I have stuff to lose. That was a very just sobering thought. And, it sparked a lot of different questions of like expansion versus contraction. And, because at that point, I felt like I was living in such an expansive way in going after what I wanted and getting the things that I had always seen for myself, And in that, I think when we come to these moments of intense trauma and just feeling so unsafe and so just like not secure at all, I think all of us sort of assign different meanings in these situations. And, there were about 5 of us who were in this situation. I think all of us have assigned a little bit different of a meaning to this experience. And for me, I can really only speak to the meaning that I've assigned to it and the impact that it's had on me. But I think as I reflected on how expansive I had been living, in that expansion, there was this moment of feeling so incredibly unsafe. And so I think what I then started to want to do was contract and to get smaller, because I'm like, well, I don't know if this like super expansiveness is safe. And so, we ended up, just to close out that story, we ended up getting to the police station. The person brings out like just a pile of stuff, and we're all just like sitting on the floor of the police station, like rummaging through things. And, there were a bunch of cards just sort of thrown into various wallets. And so we were sitting on the floor, like going through every single card that was in each of our wallets and like reorganizing amongst ourselves. And in that, we're trying to clock like what was missing. Of course, our credit cards were missing and our licenses were still missing and our electronics were still missing. But we did get our clothes back and we did get our glasses back. But, as we continued on this trip, I was still noodling on this whole like expansion versus contraction, and how I was feeling so unsafe. And really what I then started to do and what my brain started to kind of latch onto was just this very intense quest for safety moving forward. And so what that looked like when I got back to Chicago, this looks like a couple different things. The first thing that happened was I started to spend my money a little bit differently. And particularly in spending my money on traveling in a safe and easeful way. And what I mean by that is before, I was traveling back and forth from Chicago to Indy maybe every 4 to 6 weeks just to go home, visit family and friends. And in that, when I first moved to Chicago, I was taking the Greyhound bus back and forth because that's what I thought I could afford. That was the most I thought I could afford for the frequency in which I wanted to go back and forth. But in that, I was like, the Greyhound bus stations are not in safe areas for the most part. And I was even walking, like in Chicago, I was walking to these areas from the office. And as I was going on these trips and the Greyhound buses, you get all sorts of people on those buses and there's constant stops. And so the people you get on with are not necessarily the same people that are going to be on the trip throughout the duration of your trip. As I would take these Greyhound buses, it was just this intense feeling of anxiety that I had the entire time. And then I started asking myself, why the hell am I putting myself through this? Like, I'm so anxious every time I'm on these buses, and it's like a 3-hour trip one way. So I'm spending 6 hours making myself anxious by putting myself in these situations. So then I upgraded myself to taking the Amtrak train. Now, the trip was a bit longer, but at least the train felt a little bit more upscale. You know, you don't necessarily have the same crowd on an Amtrak train than you would on a Greyhound bus. And so when this San Francisco incident happened, I remember going back to Chicago and saying to myself, there's no way in hell I'm ever taking an Amtrak or a Greyhound bus again. The only way I will go back and forth from Chicago to Indy is by plane. I'm only taking American Airlines or United, and I'm only traveling by plane. And in that, I'm taking an Uber to the airport and I'm traveling by plane. I really started to scale myself and my spending and reallocating funds from other areas in order to spend this money in this area. And I reframed my mind to say, I'm only traveling in a way that makes me feel so safe and in a way that feels so easeful. You know, I no longer have a tolerance for anything less than that. And so that was, in a way, that was a positive thing that came out of that. And that's still how I spend my money to this day. But the other thing that, you know, as I was in this quest for safety, I remember waking up. This probably would have been a few days after I had gotten back. I remember waking up and just thinking like, I have to move home. I just have to move home. I remember commuting into work that day by one of the CTA buses. And I remember texting a couple of my best friends and just being like, I'm moving home. I'm moving home. I'm tired of this place. I just want out. And it's interesting because at this time, I know I was spiraling on this whole like, oh my God, for the first time in my life, I have stuff to lose. And that's really scary. But in hindsight, what I also wasn't thinking about was the fact that like, if I built this before, I can build it again. I think the other thing that was really coming up with this whole like waking up and being like, I need to move, was that my nervous system was so dysregulated and I didn't feel like my feet were on the ground. And I don't know if part of that was due to the fact that I was living on the 19th floor and literally was not like anywhere near the ground for most of the time, you know, outside of work and stuff. And so I think for one, I was not processing the feelings around just what had just happened and feeling so unsafe and really acknowledging myself in those feelings. And when you pile on like the stresses of work and the stresses of everyday life, you know, it just got to feel like so much. It was just like everything was bubbling over. I was just operating from this place of dysregulation. Like I could not regulate my nervous system to save my life. I didn't even have the language or the knowledge of what that even was at the time. You know, I didn't know how to regulate my nervous system, or I didn't know that there was a difference between a dysregulated and a regulated nervous system. Like I just didn't know that. And this would have been in like 2018. And so really, I feel like at that time, there just was not a lot of conversation about this topic in general. And so I was just purely operating from the standpoint of I need to feel safe and I need to feel secure. And it was almost like this wounded part of me, this part of me that was so scared was just like, I'm taking the reins and we're going to safety. And, you know, in a way, I feel like this part of me was like, this expansive life we've been living is not working. And we need to contract a little bit because that's what's safe. And that's just the way forward. You know, in hindsight, I can recognize this, but as I allowed my wounded self to like fully take the reins and like go, at the time it felt empowering because I couldn't distinguish between the fact that like, oh, my wounded self is taking the steps forward here. You know, I just saw all parts of myself as one. And so as I was taking these steps forward, it felt empowering. And I'm like, I'm getting myself into a better spot. This city isn't working out for me. This situation isn't working out for me. And I'm going to a better place. And so as I felt like I was taking the empowering step, what I was really doing was stepping into a box and contracting. And I think in a way that's sort of what I wanted because that felt safe. It's only in hindsight that I can recognize that probably not the best decision. I think what I really needed in that time was to see a therapist. I think I needed to start therapy then. I didn't ultimately end up starting it until a couple years later. But in hindsight, looking back, I was making a lot of assumptions about what was right versus what was wrong. I was seeing things in a very black and white perspective. And I was only looking at it from my own perspective, which I now know was not coming from a regulated place. As I've been in therapy now for like 5 years, it's been so incredible just having an outsider have your interests 100% on their mind and like want to advocate for you, but they aren't so close to things so that they don't have as much of a bias towards one decision or another. They're just interested in advocating for you as a human being and your own growth. And so I think I really could have used a therapist at that time, but there was so much shame, at least for me and in the environments I was in and where I come from. Like there was just so much shame around therapy. And, I really even didn't start talking about the fact that I was going to therapy until like a couple years ago. And I've been in therapy for 5 years. I was just keeping it so under the radar. And, back when I was like 24, there was just so much shame around it to where it wasn't even an option in my mind. I'm like, nope, that's not something that we do. So once I woke up with this need to like move home, I started shifting everything towards that goal. And it probably took me like a year and a half to actually move back and like find a job in Indianapolis. When I moved back, I started to feel the contraction, the expansiveness down to the contraction, like pretty immediately. I had moved back into my parents' house thinking like, this is what's safe and this is what's secure. And this is, when the world feels scary, this is where I go. And in that contraction, it's really interesting. I can look back now and on all the decisions that I made in my 20s where it was coming from this point of contraction, of like needing to get smaller, going from this more expansive state to this more contracted, smaller state. These are the moments where the second I get into those situations, I have a literal like existential, what have I done dread. And these have always been a bit difficult for me to face, but in hindsight, I can see that those were all coming from me making decisions out of this need to contract. And it wasn't actually what I wanted in the end. It was what my wounded self wanted, the part of me who was like so terrified just after getting robbed in San Francisco and having all my stuff taken from me and having the Purdue police call me thinking that I'm dead and, having my belongings found in a park. It was just like, it was a lot to process. And instead of processing it, or maybe I should say my way of processing it was to contract. And, as I then lived at my parents' house for a few years, I've done stories on this. I was living there during my Saturn return and much of my Saturn return was around this very topic, but and I have an episode on that. But one of the things that started to become very clear to me was that just because I was out in the world and experienced something that made me feel unsafe, then I run back to this home that was supposed to make me feel safe. Yes, it was making me feel safe in the way that I felt unsafe when I was out in San Francisco, moving about the world. But when I was living at home, it was a different sense of lack of safety. I think the hardest part about that for me to really sit with is like, who was I given the keys to make all of the decisions for myself? You know, it wasn't actually me. It wasn't my highest self. It wasn't my most grounded self. And because I was making these decisions from such a dysregulated state, I was giving the keys of my decision making to my wounded self. And then when I moved back home, I was in a different way giving my keys of decision making about my life over to my parents. And just by way of living inside the house that they own, you know, I was going from this solo apartment that I had been able to pay for and I had built this life, and then I was moving back into this home that I didn't have a stake in the game on. You know, it put a very interesting power imbalance in place, and one that I was not used to because I had experienced this real sense of ownership and not, you know, I didn't own the apartment, but like I was renting it and I was like holding it. I was supporting myself in having this. And so, you know, it just created these very interesting like power imbalances and like frustration around me having put myself in this box and handing over the keys to my own decision making in ways. They say that the words you speak become the house you live in. I firmly believe that's true, but I also want to flip that around in that the house you live in become the words that you speak. And so I think what's so gut-wrenching for me about this is that here I was trying to get myself to a place of feeling safe again, but I was also exposing myself to other things that were causing me pain. And so as I was trying to cope with one set of pain, I was inflicting another set of pain onto myself. And so, you know, I think my biggest blind spot in all of this was back at the beginning, where it's just like, yeah, I started to want to contract because I felt scared. And oh my gosh, what would have happened if I had the language and the knowledge and the resources and the support to catch it then, to say, I'm feeling so unsafe right now. I'm wanting to blow up my life because I feel scared. I'm wanting to contract because I feel scared. I just experienced this really scary thing, and I'm not quite sure what to do with those feelings. You know, had I caught that then and worked through those feelings in a productive way, I think the past several years of my life would have been different. I'm not coming at this from a place of regret. I know that my purpose in this life is to take unconventional paths, make unconventional decisions, and learn from it so that I can talk about my experience and share my wisdom. I know that that is part of just what I'm supposed to do on this earth. So I'm not coming at this from a place of regret. But, you know, throughout the past few years, I've worked through a lot of these feelings, and I've gathered all these other tools and languaging and knowledge on what to do with these types of feelings when they come up, or like when something really scary happens, how can you resource and ground and get back into your body? And this has just brought me to this ultimate lesson of just like, the thing that has changed my quality of life so much is not looking for safety and security outside of myself. I'm not giving the keys of my decision making, of one's ability to create safety. I'm not giving those keys to anyone else. I'm the one that has those keys. And when I say I mean the highest version of myself. I'm not talking about giving the keys to, my wounded self that's in the driver's seat right now. I'm not talking about that. But like being able to come at decisions from the most grounded place, regulated nervous system, knowing and having built up the trust within yourself to create the safety and security that you need in order to cope with whatever comes your way. And knowing that you have the tools and the support system to process anything that comes your way has been my number one thing that has improved my quality of life. As you're watching this today, I'm sure you resonate with a part of this, or just you can think about times when you're like, oh my God, I was not making a decision from a place that felt like me, a regulated place. I just wasn't making decisions from that place, or I felt like I was shooting from the hip, or, oh, what decision was that? I think we all have our own version of this, and we all have our own version of traumatic experiences that make us feel really unsafe, and that can lead to some interesting life decisions and ones that we may not even feel like we're in the driver's seat on. And so I hope that by me sharing this with you, it gives you languaging and like permission and licensing to like fully take the reins and start to build this safety and security within yourself, and like recognize when you're looking outside of yourself for that safety and security. Recognizing if you're looking for this in a person, a place, a thing, in food, like where are you outsourcing this safety and security? And I just hope you know that you're so capable of creating this safety and security within yourself. And so I hope that this has unlocked something for you. I hope that this empowers you to make a really aligned next decision, whatever that decision is. And thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a great week. Bye.